My team saved the company, and they punished us for it. I couldn't believe what I was hearing, and for a moment I genuinely thought I had misunderstood the room. But no, the numbers were undeniable. A 250% performance improvement, millions recovered, an entire division transformed. And what did we get? Doubled workloads, no bonuses, and a manager who stood in front of us with the audacity to say that our success was the problem. Shocked doesn't begin to cover it. Humiliated is closer, but even that word felt too small for what was happening. Here's the part nobody talks about in corporate betrayal stories. It's never dramatic at first. It doesn't announce itself. It comes dressed in policy language, in team dynamics, in the soft, weaponized vocabulary of management that makes injustice sound like administration. I'd been cheated out of recognition so quietly that I almost didn't notice it happening. Almost. Because the thing about being genuinely excellent, and I say that without arrogance, just truth, is that eventually the gap between what you've built and what you've been given becomes impossible to unsee. What my team didn't know, and what even I didn't fully understand at the time, was that the story had a secret layer. That while our manager was crafting a narrative to bury our contributions, someone else had been watching everything. Someone who had built this company from nothing and hadn't stopped caring what happened inside it just because she'd stepped back from the day-to-day. And the shocking truth is that what looked like our worst professional moment was actually the final stage of something much larger. A test none of us had agreed to, with consequences none of us had anticipated. Then came the offer that changed everything. One conversation, one decision that would mean walking away from everything we'd known, and walking into something we'd have to build from scratch. Was it terrifying? Absolutely. Was it worth it? What happened next will answer that question better than I ever could, because this isn't just a story about payback. It's a story about what happens when people who've been told they're too much finally find a place that tells them, "You're exactly enough." The silence in that conference room felt like a wall closing in on me. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. After everything we'd poured into that project, after the late nights, the skipped weekends, the sacrifices nobody asked us to make but we made anyway. My name is Nancy, and at that point I still believed results protected people. My team had just delivered something extraordinary, a 250% performance leap that reshaped the entire division at Vantage Meridian Group, right here in Portland. We didn't just hit the target. We demolished it. And yet, there I was, sitting across from our manager, Derek Calloway, watching his face twist into something I can only describe as resentment wearing a tie. Derek didn't congratulate us. He didn't even acknowledge the numbers. Instead, he slid a document across the table like he was serving a sentence. Our workloads, already brutal, were being doubled. No bonuses, no recognition. Nothing but a cold stare and a speech about how our success was creating tension with the other teams. I felt the word humiliated press against my chest like a fist. We'd done everything right, and somehow that became the problem. The betrayal wasn't loud or explosive. It was quiet, bureaucratic, and somehow worse for it. I remember looking around at my teammates, Simone, Marcus, Dev, Priya, and seeing the same disbelief mirrored in every face. These were people who had sacrificed real things. Simone missed her brother's wedding for a system deadline. Marcus postponed a knee surgery for 3 months because we were in crunch. Dev worked through the weekend his father was buried, and he never said a word about it until much later. And now we were being punished for showing up that completely? The injustice of it settled into my bones like something cold and permanent. Derek's logic, if you could call it that, was that excellence without permission disrupts the ecosystem, that our results made other managers look bad, that we should have slowed down. And somewhere in that twisted reasoning, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger, exactly. Something quieter. Something that already knew this wasn't the end of the story. The truth doesn't stay buried in spreadsheets forever, And I had a feeling Derek had no idea how much of the truth had already been documented. What stung the most wasn't the punishment itself. It was the dignity being stripped away in real time. The message that excellence was a liability, that ambition without approval was insubordination. I'd heard stories about corporate betrayal before, read about it like it was some distant, dramatic thing that happened to other people in other companies. But sitting in that room, with Derek's smug silence filling every corner, I realized this was my story now. And the most dangerous thing about me? I don't walk away from stories before they're finished. That meeting was supposed to break us. Derek thought he was drawing a line in the sand. What he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that the real line had already been drawn months before that room went quiet, by someone far more powerful than Derek Calloway had ever thought to be. Months before that conference room ambush, something had happened that I hadn't fully understood at the time. I received a message, no company letterhead, no formal introduction, just a name, Naomi Voss. If you work in this industry, that name lands differently. Naomi Voss was the woman who built Vantage Meridian Group from a 2-person consultancy in Seattle into the powerhouse it had become. She'd stepped back from day-to-day operations years ago, but everyone knew she still watched. What nobody knew was how closely she was watching, or why she'd reached out to me specifically. The message was brief. She said she'd been tracking output anomalies across several divisions and that mine stood out. She didn't ask me to report to anyone or disclose the conversation. She simply said she wanted to observe, and that I should continue exactly as I was. I couldn't believe it at first. I read that message 4 times before it felt real. Part of me wondered if it was a trap, some HR stress test designed to catch ambitious employees overstepping. But something in the tone felt too precise, too knowing, to be manufactured. What I didn't realize then was that Naomi had a theory, a quiet, dangerous one. She believed that middle management at Vantage Meridian had become a suppression layer, a ceiling designed not to protect the company but to protect the people beneath it from being outperformed. She'd seen the pattern in the data. Teams that excelled tended to get backstabbed before their numbers reached the board. Project credits got redistributed, reports got softened, careers got quietly derailed. She needed proof, and she needed it to come from inside the system organically. That's where I came in. Without knowing it, I was walking into a test. The shocking part wasn't that I was being watched, it was that the watching was protective. Naomi wasn't building a case against my team, she was building one for us. Every archived file we submitted, every milestone report, every internal metric was quietly being cross-referenced by her office. While Derek was busy crafting a narrative that minimized our work, someone at the very top was building a parallel record that told the real story. And the contrast between those 2 versions of reality was going to matter more than any of us knew. Looking back, I can see it now. The karma of it. Derek spent months slowly distorting the truth, bending the numbers, reshaping the story of our work into something that served his comfort. And the whole time, someone with the power and patience to wait was watching every move. There's something deeply satisfying about knowing that the universe sometimes does keep receipts. The only problem was, I still didn't fully understand what was coming, and neither did my team. But that was about to change. There's a moment right after you've been kicked when you have 2 choices, collapse or recalibrate. I chose recalibrate, and I chose it fast. The day after Derek's little performance in the conference room, I called a quiet meeting of my own. No boardroom, no company Wi-Fi, no chance of being overheard. We met at a coffee shop 3 blocks from Vantage Meridian's Portland offices, and I laid everything on the table. 8 faces looked back at me over their cups, waiting. And I told them, we have a way out, and it's better than anything we've built here. Weeks before the punishment meeting, Naomi had called me directly. The real conversation, the one that formalized everything. She had quietly funded a spin-off venture, a fully operational company called Meridian Edge. and it had been structured with one specific purpose: to absorb high-performing teams that the parent company's management was too insecure to keep. She wasn't just offering us jobs, she was offering us equity, ownership, a seat at the table we'd been building furniture for while never being allowed to sit down. I knew the offer was real, but I hadn't been certain the team would believe it until I looked them in the eyes across that coffee shop table. Each member of my team would receive a salary increase of no less than 35% above their current Vantage Meridian pay. But more than the money, what she was offering was dignity, a workplace architecture designed to reward excellence rather than punish it. No suppression layers. No territorial managers sitting on top of innovation like they were guarding eggs. At Meridian Edge, the people who produced would be the people who owned. The self-worth that Derek had spent months trying to erode? It was going to be the founding principle of our new company. I watched the faces around that table shift from exhaustion to something electric. Simone, who'd missed her brother's wedding for Vantage Meridian and never got so much as a thank you, pressed her lips together and nodded slowly like she was making a decision she'd been waiting to make for years. Marcus, still walking with a slight limp from his postponed surgery, leaned forward and said, "When do we sign?" Dev said nothing, but his eyes said everything. Quiet, certain, resolved. These weren't people choosing between jobs. They were reclaiming themselves. The plan was clean. We would all resign simultaneously, on the same morning, without warning. No drama, no confrontation, no long goodbyes. Just a coordinated exit that would leave Derek Calloway standing in his own silence, wondering what just happened. We had our records. We had our credibility with clients. We had Naomi's backing. What we were walking away from wasn't just a toxic company. It was the version of ourselves that had accepted being undervalued. And what we were walking into was something that hadn't been built yet, but we were absolutely the right people to build it. The morning 9 resignation letters hit Derek Calloway's inbox at 9:03 a.m. I imagine the look on his face was something between confusion and panic. We didn't stay to see it. By the time he'd read the first one, we were already gone. Boxes packed the night before, access badges placed neatly on desks, not a single dramatic exit speech. Just gone. And I think that silence hit him harder than any confrontation could have. Because Derek was the kind of man who needed to feel in control of endings, and we'd taken that from him entirely. But men like Derek don't absorb losses quietly. The truth is, I should have expected what came next. But even knowing his character, the speed of his retaliation shocked me. Within 48 hours of our departure, our phones were lighting up with messages from clients we'd worked with for years. The messages weren't angry, they were confused. Because Derek had gotten to them first. He'd called a handful of our key accounts directly and painted a picture of our team as disgruntled, incompetent employees who had lied about results and were now being let go for ethical violations. It was breathtaking in its dishonesty. He didn't stop at clients. Derek began circulating stories internally at Vantage Meridian, telling other departments that we had been backstabbed by our own inflated egos, that the 250% performance numbers were fabricated, that the whole project had been a collective fiction we'd cooked up to leverage our way into better offers elsewhere. The betrayal of it was almost artistic. He was rewriting our history in real time, knowing that most people inside the company would believe whatever narrative came from management first. And for a few days, I felt the ground shifting beneath my feet. What kept me steady was knowing that we'd anticipated this. Not because I'm psychic, because I've worked in enough organizations to know that powerful men with fragile egos and wounded pride don't concede defeat gracefully. They fight back with the only tools they have: rumors, manipulation, and the institutional authority to make lies sound like policy. Derek had all three at his disposal, and he used every last one. The infidelity here wasn't romantic, it was professional. He'd betrayed the people who built his division's success, and now he was trying to burn the evidence. The humiliating part from Derek's perspective, was that he hadn't yet realized how well prepared we were. He was operating as if we were still the people who'd sat quietly in that conference room absorbing his double workload without flinching. But we weren't those people anymore. We'd already spent weeks building our defense. And while Derek was busy assassinating our reputations, we were already on the phone, making calls that were about to completely flip the story. The first rule of fighting a false narrative is, don't panic, don't react, and never let the other person control the timeline. I'd learned that the hard way in a previous life, a past job where I stayed silent while someone else told a story about me that wasn't true, and I paid for that silence for years. This time, we moved fast and we moved together. Within 24 hours of Derek's calls hitting our clients, my team and I had divided the contact list and begun making our own calls, methodical, calm, and absolutely devastating to his version of events. Our approach wasn't defensive. We didn't call to say, Derek is lying. That would have sounded desperate, exactly what Derek wanted. Instead, we called to thank our clients for the partnerships we'd built, to introduce Meridian Edge, and to walk them through the real performance data we had documented from our time at Vantage Meridian. Every number was authenticated. Every project outcome was time-stamped and sourced. We weren't telling clients the truth, we were showing them. And there's a profound difference between those two things when someone's been fed a lie. I couldn't believe how quickly the tide turned. Client after client told us they'd found Derek's call strange, unprofessional, almost desperate in its tone. Several of them, 3 of our largest accounts actually, expressed something I hadn't dared hope for. They wanted to follow us, not as some dramatic act of loyalty, but simply because our track record spoke for itself, and they trusted the people who'd delivered results more than they trusted the manager who'd called them out of nowhere to undermine those same people. The truth, when it's backed by documented proof, doesn't need to shout. Simone handled the Eastern accounts and came back to our team call that evening with 6 confirmed partnership conversations. Marcus had 2 clients asking for formal proposals for Meridian Edge contracts before we'd even finished setting up the new company's website. Dev, quiet, meticulous Dev, had recorded every single call with client consent. A habit we'd all adopted after Naomi advised us to create a paper trail of everything. The karma of it was almost poetic. Derek had called our clients to destroy our credibility, and instead handed us the platform to establish it on new ground. But even as the calls went well, I knew this wasn't over. Derek's retaliation had escalated quickly from whisper campaigns to something more dangerous. By the end of that week, word reached us through a former colleague still inside Vantage Meridian. Derek had gone to legal. He was preparing formal accusations, and the language being used inside the company was no longer just embarrassing. It was criminal. The story was shifting from bad employees who left to corporate espionage, and the board was about to get involved in a way nobody had planned for. I've walked into a lot of rooms in my career. Rooms where I was the only woman. Rooms where I was the youngest. Rooms where I could feel the skepticism before I'd said a word. But walking into Vantage Meridian's boardroom for an emergency session, summoned, not invited, under formal accusation, was a different kind of weight entirely. Derek had filed complaints alleging corporate espionage, unauthorized client solicitation, and misappropriation of proprietary data. I couldn't believe the audacity of it. The man who'd doubled our workloads and erased our contributions was now sitting at the head of a polished table, presenting us as the villains. Derek had prepared thoroughly, I'll give him that. He had a slideshow, charts, graphs, revised performance metrics, a clean, professional presentation that told a story of our team as disruptive, self-serving, and ethically compromised. He'd taken the actual results data and run it through enough filters and reframings that the 250% performance gain we'd delivered looked, on his slides, like a statistical anomaly driven by cherry-picked reporting. The manipulation was sophisticated, not amateur-hour dishonesty, but deliberate architectural deception. He'd clearly had help preparing it, And that told me everything about how scared he actually was. The board had convened not because they believed Derek entirely, but because accusations of this formal severity required an official record, a process, a review, a contained response to legal risk. That distinction mattered. I sat on the opposite side of that table with Simone beside me, both of us still, both of us letting Derek finish. Because the worst thing we could do in that room was react. Derek needed us rattled. He needed us to look emotional, defensive, unstable. Anything that would make his version of events look more credible by comparison. We gave him none of that. We gave him nothing but patience. And patience in a room like that is its own kind of power. What Derek didn't know, what the board didn't yet know, was that we hadn't come to that room empty-handed. While Derek had spent the past 2 weeks crafting a narrative, we had spent those same weeks building something far more dangerous than a presentation, proof. Not the kind that required interpretation or context or carefully worded explanations. The kind that is so clean and undeniable that it makes everything built against it look exactly like what it is. Fiction constructed by a man who was shamed by the excellence he couldn't control. I remember the moment Derek finished his presentation and looked across the table at me with something that wasn't quite confidence. It was expectation. He expected me to stumble. He expected me to reach for words and come up short. He expected me to be the version of myself that had sat silently in that conference room accepting a doubled workload without protest. But I am not that woman anymore. And as I reached for the folder in front of me, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. The absolute, grounded calm of someone who knows exactly what's about to happen next. There's something deeply satisfying about the moment a carefully constructed lie meets an immovable fact. Not a loud satisfaction, not the kind you perform, the quiet kind, the kind that lives in your chest like a warm, settled weight, while everything around you starts to shift. That's exactly what I felt when I opened that folder on the boardroom table and began presenting what we'd built. Not in desperation, not in anger, but with the clean, unhurried confidence of someone who'd been preparing for this moment since before Derek even knew there was a game being played. Months before our resignations, our team's data analyst, a meticulous, brilliant woman named Priya, had begun quietly archiving every project record, every performance metric, every internal communication tied to our division's work. Not because we knew what was coming, but because Priya believed in documentation the way other people believe in insurance. You hope you'll never need it, but you build it anyway. Every file was time-stamped, independently authenticated, and stored on a secured external server that had nothing to do with Vantage Meridian's internal infrastructure. Derek had falsified the company records. What he couldn't falsify was ours. I walked the board through 12 months of authenticated output data. The real numbers, the real timelines, the real client feedback that had been stripped from the official reports Derek submitted. The truth was clinical and merciless. Every place where Derek's presentation showed a statistical anomaly, our records showed a documented breakthrough. Every metric he'd softened or reframed, we had the original version with its original timestamp and its original author's signature. The betrayal written into his slides became undeniable when placed side by side with what actually happened, and you could feel the temperature in that room change in real time. 2 of the board members leaned forward. One of them picked up a printed page and held it next to Derek's projected slide, as if physically measuring the gap between the 2 versions of reality. Shocking. That's the word that came to mind watching Derek's expression transition from composed hostility to something unraveling quietly behind his eyes. He'd lied to the board, not once, not in passing, comprehensively, deliberately, and with enough preparation to suggest this wasn't his first time rewriting someone else's contribution into invisibility. The room knew it. Derek knew the room knew it. And then, just as the silence in that boardroom reached the kind of density that makes people shift in their seats and reach for their water glasses, the door opened. I hadn't planned this. I didn't need to. because the person who walked in wasn't someone I'd called, wasn't someone I'd arranged. She was there because the formal nature of the session had triggered a governance protocol that involved her directly, and the room's entire atmosphere changed the second Naomi Voss walked through that door. Naomi Voss doesn't announce herself. She doesn't need to. There's a specific kind of authority that doesn't come from volume or posture. It comes from history, from the kind of track record that walks into rooms before the person does. When she stepped through that boardroom door in her gray blazer, carrying nothing but a single leather portfolio, every member of that board sat up slightly straighter without consciously deciding to. Derek's face went a color I don't have a clean word for. Somewhere between humiliated and suddenly, viscerally aware that the story he'd been telling was about to be exposed in front of the people whose opinion of him actually mattered. Naomi took a seat at the table without being invited to, because she was never not invited, she'd built the table, and opened her portfolio. She confirmed, in the calm, measured tone of someone reading back facts they've known for a long time, that the board had approved the Meridian Edge subsidiary months before any of us resigned. The paperwork, the funding allocations, the strategic rationale, all of it had been reviewed and greenlit at a level Derek had never had access to. His emergency had been anticipated. The investigation he'd triggered wasn't an investigation of my team. It was the final chapter of an investigation of him. The room absorbed this in stages. The board members who'd been watching Derek's presentation with carefully neutral expressions were now watching Naomi with something far less neutral. The kind of attention that signals a recalibration happening in real time. Because what Naomi was describing wasn't just a subsidiary launch. She was laying out, in precise and documented language, a pattern of behavior. How Derek Calloway had spent years suppressing high-performing teams within Vantage Meridian, redirecting credit, manipulating upward reporting, and constructing a leadership identity entirely built on making sure no one beneath him ever visibly outperformed him. The vengeance here didn't come from me. It never needed to. I hadn't planted Naomi in that room. I hadn't scripted her portfolio or coordinated her timing. She had arrived because the system she built had a self-correcting mechanism, and that mechanism was her. The payback for Derek's years of institutional betrayal wasn't a dramatic confrontation, wasn't a shouting match, wasn't even particularly emotional. It was a woman with a leather portfolio and 30 years of receipts, calmly reading back the truth in a room full of people who had the power to act on it. I looked at Derek once during Naomi's testimony. Just once. And what I saw wasn't defiance. It was the particular stillness of someone who understands, fully and finally, that it's over. The karma had arrived wearing business casual. And the most extraordinary part? This wasn't the end of the story. It was the beginning of what we'd actually been building all along. Something that was never about destruction, never about tearing anything down. It was always about what comes next. The day we officially opened Meridian Edge's doors, it rained in Portland. Not dramatically, just a steady, quiet Pacific Northwest drizzle that covered the windows of our new office on Morrison Street and made the city look like it was exhaling. I stood in the middle of a room that still smelled like fresh paint and furniture wrap and thought, this is what reclaiming feels like. Not triumphant and loud, just real, just earned. After everything, the betrayal, the boardroom, the retaliation, the years of watching our work disappear into someone else's performance review, we had a room of our own, and nobody was going to take the credit for it. Building Meridian Edge wasn't just a professional pivot, it was a structural act of justice. We designed the company from the inside out around the principle that excellence should be rewarded, not managed into mediocrity. Every team lead had equity. Every performance review was transparent and bidirectional, meaning your manager got reviewed by you as much as you got reviewed by them. There were no suppression layers, no gatekeepers sitting between innovation and the people with the power to fund it. The whole architecture was built as a direct answer to everything Vantage Meridian had gotten catastrophically wrong. The clients came. not all at once and not without work. But they came. Several of the accounts we'd personally called during Derek's retaliation campaign signed formally with Meridian Edge within the first 60 days. Word traveled the way it always does in professional networks, not through advertising but through trust, through the quiet circulation of, "Have you worked with these people? Because you should." Within 4 months, we had a client roster that rivaled what our division had managed at Vantage Meridian, except now the revenue it generated belonged to us. Not to Derek's bonus pool, not to a structure designed to keep us grateful for scraps. Self-worth, I've come to understand, isn't something you find in a motivational quote. It's something you build, decision by decision, boundary by boundary, project by project. Every time my team chose not to shrink, not to accept the version of reality Derek was selling, we were adding a brick to something. We didn't know what it was going to look like when we started, but by month 4, standing in a morning team meeting surrounded by people who were thriving, genuinely, measurably, visibly thriving, I understood what we'd been building all along. We'd been building proof. Proof that the way Derek ran things wasn't inevitable. It was just one choice, and we'd chosen differently. The irony was, and I say this without vengeance in my voice, just observation, that Vantage Meridian began losing ground in exactly the areas our division used to dominate. Their Q3 numbers were soft. 2 more senior teams had left in the months following our departure. The institutional knowledge Derek had tried to bury was now walking around in competitor offices, growing. You can suppress excellence for a while. You can punish it, manipulate it, lie about it, cheat the people who produce it out of their due recognition. But excellence, ultimately, finds somewhere to go. And when it does, it takes the receipts with it. 7 months after we walked out of Vantage Meridian, I got a call from a former colleague who'd stayed behind. Her voice was careful. The tone people use when they're delivering news they're not sure how you'll receive. She told me that Derek Calloway had been removed from his position following a company-wide leadership review. Not dramatically, not publicly. The way institutions quietly dispose of problems they're embarrassed to have ignored for so long, with a restructuring announcement and a carefully worded internal memo that said everything and admitted nothing. I couldn't believe it had taken this long. And then I thought, no, actually, I can believe exactly that. The justice of it landed differently than I'd expected. I won't pretend I'd spent no time imagining this moment. I'm human, and the humiliation of that conference room had lived rent-free in my chest for months. But when the call came, what I felt wasn't triumph. It was something quieter, a kind of resolution. Like the last page of a chapter turning, not with a dramatic flourish, but with the soft, definitive click of a thing finally settling into the truth it was always meant to arrive at. Derek's removal wasn't my victory. It was the company's correction. And there's a significant difference between those two things. Vantage Meridian restructured its entire management evaluation framework in the months that followed. The board implemented peer review accountability for mid-level managers. Several of the performance reporting systems that Derek had used to manipulate data were replaced with independently audited processes. The payback wasn't dramatic, but it was thorough. The institution that had backstabbed its own high-performing teams was now quietly building the systems it should have had years ago. I'd like to think our story had something to do with that. Not because we set out to reform them, but because the truth, once it's in a boardroom, has a way of leaving marks. At Meridian Edge, we marked our 7th month with a partners' dinner. 9 people around a table in a room we owned, sharing a meal that we paid for with revenue we generated. Simone laughed, genuinely, fully laughed, for the first time in what felt like years. Marcus had finally had his knee surgery and came to dinner walking without a limp. Dev gave a short, understated toast that said more in 4 sentences than most speeches say in 20 minutes. I looked around that table and thought, this is what dignity restored looks like. This is what happens when people who were shamed for their excellence decide to build their own table instead of fighting for a seat at someone else's. Revenge, I've learned, is not a demolition. It's not the satisfaction of watching someone fall. Real vengeance, the kind that actually heals something, is the life you build after someone tried to convince you that you weren't worth building one. It's the company with your name on the door. It's the equity stake in something that didn't exist until you refused to accept less. It's the look on your colleague's face when she realizes she will never again miss something important for a manager who doesn't know her name. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a dinner. Sometimes it's a balance sheet. Sometimes it's just knowing, deeply, quietly, without needing anyone else to confirm it, that you built something real, and nobody can take the credit for it this time. So tell me something. Have you ever worked somewhere that punished you for being too good? Have you ever poured yourself, completely, unreservedly, into something, delivered results that nobody could argue with, and still walked away feeling invisible? Because if you have, I need you to know, you are not the problem. You were never the problem. And the story we just walked through together? It's proof of that. Real justice doesn't always come from a confrontation. Sometimes it comes from a decision. The decision to stop making yourself smaller for people who are threatened by your size. I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever been backstabbed at work by someone you trusted? Have you ever had your contributions minimized, your results rewritten, your name removed from the story you actually wrote? Or maybe you're living that right now, sitting in a meeting room feeling exactly the way I felt before that offer arrived. Whatever your experience is, share it. Because the comment section of this video isn't just a comment section, it's a room full of people who have been through something similar and need to know they're not alone in it. And here's my challenge to you. If this story made you feel something, if it stirred up something you've been carrying, don't just watch and scroll. Be specific. Tell me the moment. Tell me the person. Tell me what your version of reclaiming looked like, or what you wish it had looked like. The most powerful thing that can happen in a space like this is when real stories meet each other, and something in the recognition heals what the original wound left behind. If you're not subscribed yet, this is your moment, because what we do here is not surface level. We don't do easy takes or comfortable answers. We go into the stories that most people are too polished to tell. The family betrayals, the corporate vengeance, the moments where dignity was stolen and then quietly, structurally, permanently reclaimed. Hit subscribe. Turn on the notifications. Because the stories ahead will make you question everything you've been taught about staying silent. And you don't want to miss a single one.